Hi everyone, and welcome to me explaining my experiences with building a array-based solution and how much it's faster or not than a traditional COUNTIF. And basically the way the video is going to be is that I'll explain to you what the task is, I'll show you what the outcome is, and then I'll show you most of the code. It's nothing secret about it, it's just I don't want to bore you with all the details. It's not going to be a hand-holding video. The expectation is that you have a vague idea about things like COUNTIFs, and even if you don't really know how to code arrays, I will explain bits of it, but I won't hold your hand. There's Google, there's Stack Exchange. But I think you'll find this very useful because I will point out a few things, what to do, what not to do. So what we have here is a data set from an Outlook connection, where this is from a HR department of whichever company, and obviously it's been sanitized and there's nothing that you can find in here, but the idea is you have a few months worth of data, and actually you have 2 months worth of data, 3 teams, 2 agents, A and C. I don't know why I ended up not having a B, but it doesn't really matter because it's all for educational purposes. And then we have a whole bunch of categories, and basically the idea was initially that each email they had fell into up to 4 categories, where you have things like category 1 being, I don't know, the region, like the USA, EMEA, a whole bunch of other things. And then category 2 would be the type of question. Category 3 would be the team that sent it, whereas this is more like the team that received it, sort of thing, and so on and so on. And all the CA, CB, all the others, is the first character is always the category number. C just stands for category. A is basically 1. B is 2, 3 would be C, and so on and so on. And I'll explain why I did it this way, because of course this came from an actual bit of code and an actual bit of data, so some of this might or might not make an awful lot of sense at the moment, but it will. So the task is that we want to create a count of things to say how many of each possible combination of a Cartesian product there are. And we have 508 rows of data, plus the header, which we don't care about. And we want to find a solution to do this efficiently and do a Cartesian product, count all the things, and take it from there. And this video is not going to cover the take it from there part, but it will cover up until there. So the outcome is this, which is a Cartesian product, and I will explain in a moment how we got to it. And you'll find that we have about 78,000 rows in the Cartesian product, and the outcome is 2 identical columns. One is by using COUNTIFs, and the sum is 508, which is what we're expecting, and the other is using arrays in VBA, which is again 508. And I will explain how this whole thing's being done, and then talk to you about which one's faster and why. So what we basically have is this data, which then gets amended to say, like for example, this one has category 2, category 3, and category 4, but no category 1. This just has 2 and 4. So the idea is that the first bit of the code amends this to make sure that everything's trimmed and everything has 4 categories. So this will end up having something like 1 empty, 2 CH, 3 empty, 4 CI, whatever is there. And that gets thrown into a bunch of tables, and this is all done in code. And you see you have the uniques, and that will eventually go into the pivot. So how's this being done and why is this being done? This whole logic uses collections and just has an honor resume next to say if an element is already in the collection, then obviously don't freak out and just keep it unique. We then turn that into a table, and we basically make a pivot table with an underlying data model, which you have here. And this is all done in code. And the reason why we have this in a separate sheet is because the code is supposed to be run every month. And although it hasn't been fully completed yet, but the idea is that because it's being run every month, the pivot cache that's lying under this whole thing is supposed to change. And the annoying thing with a pivot table is that unless you force the whole thing into a brand new workbook, you can't destroy and remake the pivot cache, and refreshing it won't really do the job because you'll end up with an awful lot of useless, silly data. So we are forced to shove everything into a new workbook. And in here, the tables is identical. That's basically a copy. And then the raw data is just the amended column, as I said, which just has all the months, all the teams, all the people, all the categories, including empty, empty, empty. And there is a comma at the end on purpose because in real life, if you end up having two categories where one is management and the other is management support, then counting management will be double counted because management support contains the characteristic management. So the idea is that by forcing everything to have a comma at the end, it's basically being used as a delimiter, which keeps the data sanitized and clean. Okay, let's have a look at the code and then see what comes up. So I'm not going to explain this line by line, and I haven't done an awful lot of comments because I'm not good at doing commentary, plus it's my own code, so I vaguely know what's in it. But we have defined this sheet, and we basically do the amending and just make sure that it's all cleaned up, as I said. So we make sure that we do have dynamic number of categories, and then we say if the character 1 to 7 or 1 to 4 in this case is not being found, then stick it in there and make it empty. So essentially that's how we end up having 11 being this one, where you have just, character 1 wasn't found, character 3 wasn't found, so it ended up being tagged at the end saying 1 empty, 3 empty from this. And of course these 3 have been amended, and we then basically shove this into an array. And this, I ended up leaving it as an array because it just makes my life easier. I will demonstrate how much faster arrays are later on versus a COUNTIFS and all the caveats. So we then get rid of the table sheet and make a new one. And as I said, we have a collection. So essentially what happens here is that, of course, if you have a look back here, then there's no particular order, because sometimes number 2 comes first, sometimes number 4 comes first. So we can't just easily loop through. So we build a collection and we split it and just shove individual unique elements into the array. And then we move on to the table sheet, which is this one. And at that point, this is, of course, blank. And we then basically go through the idea to say if it's a month source or agent, then shove it into the first 3 columns. If it's a category, then depending on which category it is, shove it into the appropriate column. There are a few restrictions here, so it has to start with the appropriate number and so on and so on. But that's why that's actually why these have been converted into characters, like alphabetic characters other than alphanumeric characters, so it doesn't get confused. And eventually it just makes a unique bunch of tables. We then get rid of the array, and if you're not particularly familiar with arrays, then the idea is that you shove stuff into the memory, and the memory being significantly faster than the UI and the disk, it basically runs a lot faster reading out of the arrays in the memory. But of course, once you no longer need the array, you should get rid of it because it takes up memory. And nowadays, basically no one in their right mind uses 32-bit computers or Excel, but 32 bits are limited to 4 gigs minus all the things Windows uses, so you can't really do large arrays in 32-bit systems, and you're nonetheless limited by your physical memory, so dump anything you don't need. We then create a pivot table, and this is all dynamic because, of course, in different months we may or may not have more categories, we may or may not have more of anything. So the pivot and the data model are being dynamically built, so it can account for anything. We then basically shove this onto another workbook, as I said, otherwise it gets a bit silly. And then we get rid of the original array because we no longer need it. That one. And at this point, we basically have an empty pivot table, and we apply a bit of formatting, and this was coming out of a recorded macro, of course, because I'm not going to type up all this rubbish. And then again, just to say, we want an order of things, and yes, month, source and agent come first, but just in case it doesn't, for any reason whatsoever, we're specifying those 3, and then we make sure that each category is numeric order, and just make sure it gets positioned where it's supposed to be. So you get that idea. We get rid of the totals, and we make sure it's tabular, and we make sure that every value is being repeated. So you basically end up with this. And as I said, this is off, that one's off, layout is tabular, and everything's being repeated. So we do have a Cartesian product. And then this is where, of course, I would only be running this, but I made 2 subs, and one is based on COUNTIFS, and the other is based on pivots. And for the COUNTIFS, it's very simple. Basically, all we're saying, not using any arrays, and the logic is something along the lines of COUNTIFS. I'm not really going to do the whole thing, but we say that one, and then star, let's say star and this, and we then get that, and basically all the other criteria are one of each, just this way, which is what you have here. And as you can see, this is not using arrays, it's using ranges. It loops, it has to loop, of course, and we just build up the worksheet function COUNTIFS as I did a moment ago, and we then dump that value, whatever comes out of it, here. So this loops through, reading each of these, looking at each of these, and then putting it back here for each of the rows. Now, here comes the longer part about arrays, and here the assumption is that you may or may not know an awful lot about arrays. You probably know some of it, but not all of it, which is why you're watching. So unlike worksheet functions, arrays do not work at all with columns. So you cannot do an easy COUNTIF or COUNTIFS, most of all, with an array, because you must loop through each and every element of it, which makes certain tasks a bit annoying, because of course if you think, how do you want to count ifs, something that has to be a multi-dimensional array and you must go row by row, and you actually end up using reverse logic. So we have a few of the things defined here, and I like to do a do events just so that I know what the hell's going on and just get an idea as to where we are. And we define just a few things. So we are defining an output array, which for those of you that know it ends up being more than the needed dimensions, and I will explain to you in a moment why that's being done, as much as it looks silly. There's logic to the madness. We then basically say we have a boolean that says, has the character strings that we're looking at been not found? So the way this goes is, for each row we're going through this stuff, and we then look at each and every column within what's now book 9. So we look at this, we look at that, we look at that, we look at that. So the idea is that, does month A appear in here? Yes or no? Does team A appear in there? Yes or no? Does whichever category for being 4CC appear in here? And no, it doesn't, because that's a CI. And so we basically say, if any of those do not appear, if that is 0, then switch this one to 2, and don't waste time, exit this loop, just this one, move on to the next row. And basically the idea is that if by the end of the whole column run, which is to say each of these have been found, and observe that we are looking at the comma, so we're making sure that we're not double counting stuff. So if each of those has been found, then the count value gets bumped up by 1. And that's how many times eventually we will find our thing. So that's how you do a COUNTIFS with an array. And of course the whole thing with arrays is that they take, well, comparatively long amount of time to code, but they're a lot faster if you're doing them right. And this is how you learn that whole logic. And then we shove this into the output array, which then eventually ends up being shoved back onto here. Now, a few things, and this is where we go back to why the output array has, no, not this one, this one. Why the output array has an extra dimension. And it is because if you have a 2-dimensional array, then you cannot possibly just dump it on a workbook, on a worksheet. Because in Excel's mind, normal boring 2-dimensional arrays are actually horizontal, even if you define them as vertical. So you must transpose them. The problem you have is that transposition has an upper limit, and actually it's not a particularly high number. So if your array happens to be more than 60,000 rows, then you will end up with a bunch of null values which represent themselves as NA errors, and your data is totally useless. So what you want instead, define your array as having an extra totally empty dimension. And yes, it takes up a bit more memory, but I think, don't quote me on this, I think as long as those values are null, then they shouldn't really take up an awful lot of space in the memory. And then it being a multi-dimensional array, you can just happily dump it where it needs to go. And that's the underlying idea with the code. So what I will do now is close this, and I will run the code, and at this point I will speed up the video because it's actually going to take about 2 or 3 minutes to complete, and I'm pretty sure you don't care about all that. So that's just running, and what you will find is that, of course, the array version is significantly faster, but I will get back to you in a moment and talk to you about why it's faster and how to make sure it's faster. Okay, so that's done, and the arrays took half as long as the COUNTIFs. And I know there is a row mismatch between these two, but we don't actually care about that. And the reason we don't care about that is because it's just me being a bit silly. But if you ever look at it, all the lines line up as they should. And 508, 508. Okay, when I was initially trying to do this, I actually found that the arrays were not faster at all. In fact, they were significantly slower. And that was because I don't have that code anymore, but what you may or may not know is that what really takes up time in running code in VBA is anything that modifies whatever is on the UI. So that's why we usually turn off calculation, and that's why we usually turn off the screen updating. And actually, as you see here, that's where I'm turning it back on. But what I used to have was running this whole array, and the output array didn't exist at the time. And what was happening is that even though this whole calculation was running inside of the array, it was still being dumped onto the sheet one by one here. And that really does not help. It basically slows down everything about threefold, which then means it's not worth the effort. So if you are going to do stuff with arrays, then you really want to do it all the way through, which is why we have the output array, and that gets dumped onto the sheet at the end. So don't just do half work, because it, as you can see here, it's actually about 3 lines of code, which is, yes, exactly, 2 lines more than sticking an extra line of code would be here, but then, it's not the end of the world. So that kind of concludes the video, and I just hope you found this useful and insightful. The code's not a secret, but I'm not going to explicitly put it anywhere. I think you've had plenty of time reading it from the screen, and I think you will find a lot of help online as to how you do this. Apart from the COUNTIFs in arrays, which I haven't really found at all, which is partially why I'm doing this video. Any questions you may have, drop a comment. I shall attempt to answer them as well as I can. Thank you for watching.